Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 436, The Wind Tapped Like a Tired Man. Now, when this one was published in 1891, it was actually called The Wind's Visit. And it's possible this may be another variation on Emily's riddle poems. What is the wind going to symbolize? Or is she just literally talking about the wind somehow blowing through the house? Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked through the preceding 435 poems. We just finished with 435, Much Madness is Divine as Sense. And I'm hopeful then that you can set this poem within those other poems that we've already studied that we called riddle poems. What exactly is it that Emily is talking about? Here, the wind will be personified like an old man who comes to visit. But I think there's something more profound going on here. I think Emily is tapping into a famous story in the book of John, the 3rd chapter, where there's a person who comes to visit Christ named Nicodemus, and he will ask Christ some theological questions, and in the process, Christ will make the observation that one must be born again. This, by the way, is right before the most famous John 3:16, for God so loved the world passage. And in verse 8 of John 3, this is what Christ says: "The wind bloweth where it listeth." I'm using now the King James Version that Emily would have known. "The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh, and whither it goeth. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit." Now, I think this poem is Emily's attempt to try to talk about inspiration. In fact, that word itself from the Greek, to inspire, spire is breath, wind. Some have read this as the Holy Spirit. I think Emily is probably, though, referencing more the muse, the poetic inspiration. She says it this way: "The wind tapped like a tired man and like a host. 'Come in,' I boldly answered. Entered then my residence within, a rapid, footless guest, to offer whom a chair were as impossible as hand, a sofa to the air. No bone had he to bind him. His speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush. His countenance a billow, his fingers as he passed let go a music as of tunes blown tremulous in glass. He visited, still flitting. Then, like a timid man, again he tapped. 'Twas flurriedly, and I became alone." Now, if we begin with a tired man, we'll end with a timid man. And the wind comes tapping, and later it will be flitting. And we cannot help but think, of course, of Poe's The Raven, yes? Tapped like a tired man and like a host, come in. In other words, inviting in the wind. Now, if you read this as poetic inspiration, as many have, then the inspiration shows up. Now, this is still today a question among creative types. Why is it all of a sudden there you are sitting, and then this amazing idea for a poem or a story or a play or whatever, a video comes to mind, and all of a sudden there it is. She says, I invited it in. Notice, I boldly answered, right? In other words, I'm willing to accept this visitor. Entered then my residence, notice, within. Now again, you can read this as literal, you can read this as symbolic. A rapid footless guest, to offer whom a chair were as impossible as hand, a sofa to the air. In other words, the inspiration she's talking about, it isn't embodied in any obvious way. Notice, no bone had he to bind him. His speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds. You'll remember hummingbirds from 334 and 380. At once from a superior bush. And I think this reading and the word superior is a giveaway here as well. His countenance a billow, his fingers as he passed let go a music. And then notice again the simile as of tunes blown tremulous in glass. The cluster of glass pendants maybe of a chandelier. He visited, still flitting. Again, we cannot help but think of Poe's Raven here. Then, like a timid man. Notice we go from tired to timid man. Again, he tapped. 'twas fluidly, and I became alone. In other words, I had a visitor, but only for a brief period of time, and then I was alone. Well, you can read this any number of ways, at two-way. I think that one way to read this is that inspiration is fleeting. It comes and it goes, and it's very hard to understand exactly why the muse visits for a while, and then the muse will leave. At 2b, well, obviously the wind as symbol comes to mind here. Are we talking inspiration? Are we talking consciousness? It has been read that way. Are we talking more theologically the Holy Spirit, as borrowed from the John 3 passage? At 3a, of course, the John 3 passage I think is important. I want to take us, though, to Shelley's Defense of Poetry. You'll remember in that classic, and we've given comments elsewhere at learnstrong.net, that he comments on the idea of inspiration. And, of course, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey both open with that invocation of the muse, as we call it. Of course, Milton plays the same game in Paradise Lost. We've given lectures on all those epics at learnstrong.net. The goal, of course, of the poet is, will you enter, will you come within, to use her language, will you enter and will you give me some information that I can then share through my poem or through my writing. Finally, at 3b, what was a time when the wind visited you? Some of you are saying it's happening more and more as I'm getting more and more into Emily. I hope so. Thank you.